Good evening, everybody. As John mentioned the fact that I served in World War II, and he wanted to talk about what it was like coming home. And before I do, I would like to make a couple of comments about World War II. Several years ago, a guy by the name of Tom Brokaw wrote a book about the greatest generation. And if you're a part of it, it was certainly fun reading. But from my humble opinion, it's not true, because all generations are great. I do not believe that one generation is greater than another one. But the trouble is, we try to measure generations against one another, but the circumstances are so much different. And so if you don't look at the circumstances, we judge the young unfairly too often. Many times, people forget that in our long history, the only time we were ever attacked by a foreign power was World War II. All the rest of them, whether it was Korea or Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan, there was a choice. I'm not saying it was a bad choice. I'm not saying it's a good choice. I'm not going to get into that. But there was a choice. When World War II started on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked us. And a couple of days later, Hitler declared war on the United States. I guess we had a choice. We could learn to speak German or Japanese or go fight for our survival. So with a situation like that, the public and everybody gets behind it. A lot of people forget that prior to December 7th, 1941, there was a lot of dissension in this country. Charles Lindbergh, who was a national hero for flying an airplane, actually was supporting Germany. And when the war was started, when we were attacked, he immediately wanted to enlist, and the Army wouldn't take him, because the Air Force in those days was part of the Army. They wouldn't take him because they were mad, so he shuttled airplanes. John Kennedy's father was certainly not a big supporter of our getting into World War II. So we had a lot of dissension in our own country, and I think too often we forget this. In 1940, I'm diverting just for a moment, bear with me. But in 1940, I was a junior in high school, and I think most people realized that it was just a matter of time we were going to wind up in this spectacle over there in Europe. So President Roosevelt asked for a bill to draft young men for 12 months to start, because our Army at that time probably wasn't as big as the New York City police force today. So we couldn't have beat anybody. So it passed, and before the year was up in 1941, it was getting pretty hot then, Roosevelt asked to extend that indefinitely. It passed Congress by one vote. That's how much dissension was in our country. People, I don't think I knew a person in those days that didn't realize we were going to war. Yet, it passed by one vote. And as much as we talk about the young people today, many of those who had been drafted for that 1 year, their year was almost up. They went home. They had to go back and get them. A lot of people forget all these things. So many times when we criticize the young, I think under the circumstances are the same, they would react the same. I was at a dinner here a couple years ago with my wife out in Strongsville, because I do a lot of work with the VFW. It was an awards thing. They wanted me to come out there. There was quite a crowd, and I had to go up to get myself and my wife, Elvira, a refreshment, beverage, to be honest about it. And on the way up, a table of men or citizens stopped me. The lady said, "You're World War II." I said, "Yeah." I said, "The kids today wouldn't do what you guys did." I said, "Well, lady, I disagree with you. I think under the same circumstances, our young people would do the same as we did." She said, "Why do you think that?" I said, "Well, in World War II, a high percentage of them were drafted. In fact, I was drafted. I wanted to enlist, but my parents wouldn't sign because we were farmers, and I probably could have been exempt. So on my 18th birthday, I registered for the draft. I said I wanted to go, and of course, being in a farming community, they were always short. They took me right away. I said several years ago, the government decided to go into Iraq. And on the Sunday morning talk shows, it said we'd Iraq was considered the 5th largest military establishment in the world. We'd be there for years, and these kids wouldn't be. Unfortunately, the government wasn't prepared for what they did. They won that war in 5 days, and every kid was a volunteer. Not a one of them was drafted. So many times when I think I was in a great generation, but not the greatest generation. I just feel it. All generations are good. Now, Tom has heard me make this remark many times because I feel too often we overlook that the circumstances are different. So I just wanted to pass that on. The subject they wanted to talk about tonight was coming home. Coming home is different in all wars. In some wars, we as a nation greeted them pretty good. World War II, we were greeted good, not great. A few were greeted great, like Eisenhower and Patton and that, but the rest of us, we had no complaints. And one thing was in our favor was the GI Bill was the first time World War I fellows didn't get near as good a break on it when they came home as we did. And those that went to Korea and Vietnam, especially Vietnam, certainly were not treated as good as us. I never could figure that out because of course, by the time we got to Vietnam, we had no women involved. World War II, there's no women allowed overseas except nurses. But the men and women that fought those wars didn't make the decision to go. I know that they unpopular war, but they didn't make that decision. They were drafted, they were sent there by their government, they did their best. And when they come home, sometimes they were almost spit on. It's horrible to say, but it's true. The records are available if anybody wants to see them. And you wonder why, because they did not cause any of this. They stood up for their country just like we did. It was in a different war, but getting shot at is no different in Korea than it was in Europe or Japan or Iwo Jima or Okinawa or any place else. And it was the same in Vietnam. So we should not have less respect for those that are fighting in an unpopular war. And I guess their conscience caught up to us because in Iraq and Afghanistan, we've done a marvelous job of how we've treated them when they came home. And I'm glad we did. I'm not against it. I don't mean that with envy. I say it because I think it's well earned. Tom, do you want to say anything before we get into the coming home?
Well, why don't you keep going?
For those of you that don't know me, there's a few in the room that do. You never want to tell me to get going because I don't stop. Well, no, I think life is so great, and coming home is not going to be the same for everybody. A lot of times, we try to judge those coming home as all alike, and we're not. I came from a small country town in New York State, lived on a farm, maybe 2,500 people. It was until about 10 years ago, it was a dry town. After they legalized liquor again in the Roosevelt time, they didn't go back. They just stayed dry. I was supposed to be a fairly religious town for a town of 2,500, 2,800 people. There was quite a few churches there. And in my parents' house, I always mention this because you can see how it relates. My parents at first, of course, were against my going. My mother didn't even go to the bus with me. She was mad about it. My father shook my hand and said, "I'll see you." But that was not unusual in those days. And I've been in that home until they passed on. There was never a drink served, not even a glass of wine. It was never allowed. So you can see when I came home, having been in several countries, been in Northern Ireland for Shape Up, been in France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Holland, and Germany, been wounded twice and saw a lot of combat, and our division had freed up a couple of concentration camps. you can rest assured that my coming home was quite a difference. And the second thing was, when I left, I was a student. I graduated from high school. I come back, I'm still only 20 years old, but I have gone through all of this. I was the youngest guy in the outfit when I first joined it. After my basic training, they sent me up to, they told me to call me, and they said, hey, well, you did good on your basic test. You got a high IQ. I said, you must have a bad test. I don't have a high IQ. So they sent me over to University of Alabama for a day for testing, and then they sent me to New York City to Manhattan College to be an officer and an engineer under the ASDP program. And I didn't want to do it. I thought I had all the answers. And so I didn't do the work, so they sent me down to Fort Bragg to be going to Airborne, but I had a trick knee from sports, so I couldn't be that. So they sent me over to Camp Forest, Tennessee, to the 8th Infantry. And they were on maneuvers. They were out in the field. And prior to 1940, they had been the Georgia National Guard, so they were all Southerners. So when I arrived, I threw my orders at the guy, and he says, we ain't got none of y'all. I said, we ain't got none of y'all. I said, joined with Yankees. I said, well, I'm from New York. I said, about as Yankees you get. But surprisingly, it worked out. And a couple of months later, we were on a ship going to overseas. So I was getting my education in a hurry. But I was the youngest guy in the outfit. We see we were in France, and short time we were in there, I got wounded, and I got promoted, and other things worked out. So when I come home, my parents are still remembering me as a student. I am more than a student. I'm a grown man. Maybe I'm only 20 years old, but the experiences I've had, I'm not sure it wasn't more difficult on them than me. The first night I'm home, my mother says, where are you going? I said, we don't have a couple of beers. What? What time are you coming home? What time am I coming home? I don't know. Maybe morning. I don't know. How do I know? You see, when the war ended in Europe, after we met up near Schwerin, we met the Russians, and I got to deviate at times because it relates to it. We met the Russians. That's when we had these 2 concentration camps. So the war ended then, and they told us to get the area secured, and our division would be sent to the States for a furlough, and then to be shipped to Japan. They wanted experienced combat troops to invade Japan. We weren't very happy about that because the division had already suffered over 100% casualties. You know, something, the guy said, well, you were there. You're here. I said, yeah, casualties, wounded too, you know. I was wounded twice myself. So by the time I got home, it was July 17th. And here I've gone through all of this, and you want to know what time I'm coming home tonight. I mean, it just, you know, if you stop and think about it, they're still remembering me because I hadn't been home in over 2 years, maybe probably close to 3 years, 2.5 years since I'd been home. They hadn't seen me. They'd gotten a couple of telegrams that I'd been wounded. They don't know how bad because they can't see it. And I was not a great letter writer to start with, and especially for those that were in combat, you can't always write. You're in the front lines, and you're living almost like an animal. Many times when, as John said, his grandfather didn't want to talk about it. I'm not so sure that they don't want to talk about it. I didn't at first, but then my kids started asking me questions, and come home, found some medals that I had, and I said, well, all right, I guess better talk about it. But the American public, unless you actually served over there, has no idea what real war is. I have a son that's an entertainer. Has been for all his life, be 64 in June. A few years ago, they came out with a movie called Saving Private Ryan. And I was going down to either Tonawanda or Buffalo or someplace on something I had to do. And he says, can I ride along? Dad? I said, yeah, you drive. So riding along, he says, did you see the movie Private Ryan? Yeah, I saw it. Is it really that bad? I says, no, far worse. He says, my God, how could you do it? So you see, when when they say they don't want to talk about it, and it wasn't, I'm talking about Saving Private Ryan, it was Europe. But it's the same in Vietnam in the jungles. You didn't know who was on your side or who was against you. So, you know, when you come home, you don't figure they're going to believe you anyway. I mean, seriously. You think half the people would not believe what you tell them. Because our country has never, well, the Civil War, but we're so much different in those days. Modern warfare, it's the destruction. You see, I saw, Cologne was a city that's probably bigger than Cleveland, really. When we got through with it, there was a twin cathedral standing in the city, and that's it. You saw town or city after city, there'd be nothing. Even in England, a lot of it was tore up. You can't believe it. So there's not only those that are fighting, but a lot of the people that lived there was utter destruction. So when you come home, do you really want to talk about that? So my first few days home, I wanted to get out and party, celebrate, relax. I was just glad to be alive. Most of those I'd gone over with didn't come back. So what an adjustment for a family who had never had a drink served in their home. Here I'm coming home at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and partying. I didn't hurt anybody else. I just wanted to get out and relax. And the next morning, maybe the phone would ring. My mother, hey, Bob, there's some girl on the phone. Yeah. She wasn't used to something like this. I mean, so I'm not sure when it comes to adjusting when you came back, if it wasn't actually tougher on them than us. We had memories, but they had to see a different person coming in the door, someone that was contrary to the way they had lived. So in a sense, at first I didn't have a lot of sympathy, I suppose, for them. Well, after you've been through a lot of fighting, for those who've done it, I don't know how many in the room have done it, but if you've done it, you lose sympathy in a hurry when you're in the front lines. Is first time you see a guy get killed in front of you, you get a little nervous, and the sergeant says you better stop or you're going to be next. You have to get it off your mind. You got to because you're in a battle. You got to get going. If you don't, you're not going to survive. So you get hardened to it. The second time I got wounded was up in northern France, and I felt kind of sorry for myself. It was a little worse than the first time, but still not bad. I knew I was going to survive, but I'm kind of feeling sorry for myself. And they're taking me back to the hospital. And for those that've seen MASH, that's what a frontline hospital is. It's a great big tent. You can still hear the guns. And then there's a smaller tent on the side, and that's the operating room. And then the main tent where the hospital is, it's like cots, like you go camping. They're almost side by side, just enough so the nurse can get between them. They wheeled me into that operating room to take the shrapnel out of my right leg, my shoulder, and back of my neck. But I wasn't going to be there a long time. They wheeled me in there, and there must have been 15, 20 doctors in there. There's guys in there without arms, without legs, half the face gone, half the body gone. I didn't feel sorry for myself anymore. In fact, I was embarrassed to be in there. I mean, I was glad to get there. So when you get hardened to this stuff, so when you come home, you don't have as much sympathy as maybe we should have had. I'm going to take a break. Tom, you want to take it for a minute?
All right. Well, I'd like to say it's an honor to be a part of this. I'm a great admirer of Bob's, and as you can see, he outranks me. So it's hard to be able to talk about this on the same bill. But I just wanted to mention a couple of things about my family, mentor, and the way this whole war impacted us and continues to do so. Because I think there are some ways that, again, it has a much longer effect in ways that people don't realize. And now an example of that is I am 60 years old. It has affected every single paycheck I ever earned in my life. And this is because of withholding taxes. Because prior to the war, the way the income tax was handled, you were expected to have money on hand to pay your tax liability, which wasn't likely to be very great. Now I have a relative, I should say had a relative, who was the Cleveland firefighter in the 1930s. And at some point I inherited a bunch of family papers that included his income tax returns for, say, 1938, 1939, 1940. All right, so when he worked full-time as a firefighter, and he had a small business he ran on the side, his tax liability in those years was roughly $28.50. All right, so we wrote a check for that. He was cleared with the IRS until the following year. Now, of course, when the war started, the government had to raise immense amounts of money on short notice. Now, as an example of this, I'm working on a book now, how to a young man from Menor who flew B-17 in World War II. The airplane that he flew cost $312,000. And by the time the war was over, the Army had ordered 12,000 of them. An Iowa-class battleship, for example, cost $70 million. I believe they built 4 of them. Now, of course, when the war ended, there wasn't this pressing need for all these munitions, but of course the people in Washington were not about to turn off the spigot of all that money. That's what it means forever afterward. The taxes are deducted from each and every paycheck. And I said, don't worry, at the end of the year, you'll get a little bit back. I'd rather pay $28.50. As far as that goes. Now, another thing is, I've taught at Lakeland for years. If you go back to earlier times, though, it was very unusual for people to go to college. I wrote a great book about this once that said, as of 1940, only 3% of the American population had attended college. The book was defining that as having completed 1 year of full-time study, so you did not have to have a 4-year college degree to be included in that. Thanks to the GI Bill education benefits after the war, that number had risen to 40% by 1950. And so, of course, those are the people who went out this really powerful middle class and earned good incomes, and again, really made the American economy boom. So in those 2 respects, and of course, with that withholding tax, that I'm sure is going to go on forever. So here we are 75 years after the war, still paying our taxes in that way. Now, also, as far as Menor is concerned, too, I think this is something to reflect back on, because in 1941, there was Menor Village and Menor Township, and those 2 communities combined had about 5,000 residents. Of that number, roughly 250 served in uniform during the war. 25 of them lost their lives in the process. So I think that's just a horrendous casualty rate for such a small town. And I think, too, that's a very important emphasis, too, as far as what families had to go through while this was on, and women in particular. Now, as far as the families go, I guess I should say at the outset, my interest in all this goes back a very long way. One of my closest relatives served for 2.5 years overseas during the war. He was a cousin of my father's. I guess that makes him my first cousin once removed, as far as I'm concerned. I was kind of raised to think of him as an uncle. Right, but as far as a homecoming story is concerned, when the war ended, the day the Germans surrendered in Italy, he was in a foxhole with a Browning automatic rifle taking pot shots at the Germans. And he said he could see his lieutenant approaching and going into foxholes and coming nearer to him, and he would say something briefly to the people in the foxholes, and they left. So I thought, what could this possibly be? And then, of course, the lieutenant at some point turned up in his foxhole, and he said, cease firing and go to the rear. The war is over. All right, so that's how we found out. But of course, the big question then was, how long would it take to get home? Well, the Army had originated a system of points to determine this. You had to have 85 points to be released from the Army in Europe when the war ended. And that was based on things like how long you were in the Army in the first place, how many months overseas, any campaigns you had served, and medals you had gotten. If you were married, that was worth a few points. If you had children, also. So he said he sat down with some trepidation to figure this out. So he had the end of a C ration box and the stub of a pencil. So he started adding all this up, and he turned out to have 107 points. All right, so this meant he could leave almost immediately. But the big question then was how to do this. And so he was being processed, and he said, all right, wow, am I going to get home? And he said, well, you can go to Naples and wait for 6 or 8 weeks, and we'll find his place for you on a Liberty ship, so you'll be home in a couple of months. So he was very dejected to hear that. And then they said, but of course you could fly. And this was really problematic because the only airplanes he had seen up close were flaming wrecks on the ground during all this time in the war, so he wasn't really keen about flying. But he said, how long would that take? He said, if you back up quickly and get to the airfield, you could be home in 3 days. So he said, of course, that was the deciding factor right then. So we got into an airplane, which was a converted B-17. So this took it from northern Italy to Casablanca, Morocco, which is where he landed in the first place. Now, at that point, they put him in a larger airplane. It was more appropriate to try and fly across the Atlantic. But this was also kind of problematic because they were on their way, and one of the engines failed. And it just so happened he was placed by a seat that gave an excellent view with his feathered propeller and his oil-swept engine cowling, and thought, now we're going into the ocean or something. But he said the crew chief came along and he said, don't worry, we can fly all the way to New York on 3 engines, but we're not going to do that. We're going to divert to the Azores. And he said he was dejected all over. He said, where are the Azores? They were stuck there waiting for parts for 6 months. He said they had everybody get off the airplane. They went to a mess hall, and he said they gave them coffee and donuts. And about 45 minutes later, sorry, back on the airplane, we're leaving. All right, well, to make a long story short, as he often said, he was finally discharged from the Army at Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania. So his father drove there and picked him up in a 1941 Cadillac that was kind of a legendary car in my family. This thing had a very long life, and I actually rode in that car myself as a little kid a couple of times. I have a vague memory of it. All right, but what happened is his father came and picked him up and brought him home safe and sound, but there were 2 other brothers in his family. All right, so the middle brother did the Army Air Force in the Pacific, so he was discharged from the Army at Camp Atterbury in Indiana. So Frank, the oldest son, and his father got in a Cadillac. They drove there and they picked up the second brother, so that was 2 of them home safely. The third brother was about 3 years younger than the next youngest brother, and this was also kind of an issue because he had a job in a defense plant, so he didn't have to go into the military at all. But apparently thinking about his brothers being overseas really got to working on his mind, and so he kind of did what Bob did, just kind of very abruptly made all the steps to get himself taken right into the Army. And not only that, but for good measure, he volunteered to be a paratrooper. All right, so the story in our family always was it was a moot point whether the Germans or the Japanese would have any chance to kill him before their father did, because he was so angry. You know, he said, I have all the other 2 to worry about, then you go and do this. You know, thanks a lot, kid. All right, well, what happened is he was the last one left to gather him when the war ended. And so he got a hold of his family. He said, you don't have to do anything in my case. I'm going to ride a train home to Cleveland, so just come to the station and pick me up. All right, the railroad station was what is now Tower City. And so the 2 older brothers and their father went there, and the train pulled in. And the way Frank always described this, he said as soon as the train stopped, this platform was just this sea of uniforms. It's like everybody on that train was some kid coming home from the service. And so they looked up and down, they couldn't see a little brother anywhere. It's kind of like what Bob said, you know, years had gone by. It was probably a little tough to recognize the kid they last saw, and he was 17 years old when the other ones left. All right, but what happened is the crowd drifted away with no sign of the little brother. So of course they were very disappointed. They thought he missed a connection somewhere, and they would just have to go home and wait till they heard from him. All right, so they started moving towards the stairs to leave, and with that, the little brother stepped off the train right in front of him. Now, I knew all these men pretty well in later life, and that kind of sounds just like them. I think the youngest brother thought it would be a lot more dramatic if he did it that way. All right, but then what happened is all of a sudden, all 4 of these men were together for the first time since 1942. And Frank always said that his father put on this very tough front during the war, but he said the tough front completely evaporated. He said his father broke down and cried so uncontrollably that they had to carry him physically to the car. He couldn't even walk. At that stage, like all this stress, all this worry that has been piled upon him all those years just suddenly just came crashing down on him. But the thing is, my Uncle Frank always said that he never cared when the treaties were signed or anything like that. He said that was when he considered the war actually ended. It was around Christmas time of 1945, and so again, they were all home safe, which seemed pretty unlikely given what they had been through. You know, Frank was the one I knew most about. He had 374 days of combat starting right after the first of the year in 1943, so it was probably something of a miracle. And again, that's what really got me started because I was involved with him from a very early stage, and I was just crazy about him as a kid. You know, my mother always said it was a case of love at first sight as far as I was concerned. But the funny thing is, as I grew older, I started studying a lot of this as a matter of history, and I was very impressed by the fact that I never caught him in anything I would describe even as an exaggeration, you know, let alone any kind of a falsehood. You know, so it's kind of remarkable in that respect, because he had a great story to tell, but he never saw something to embroider upon it or try to improve it in any way. And so, of course, there was a lot of adapting to him. What Bob has said really kind of reminds me of that, because how do you just stop all that someday? You want to try to go back to an earlier life. You know, this guy was joining the Army in the first place. He was only 19 years old. It wasn't like he had some career to go back and fall back upon. And it's funny, too, is he would talk your army leg off about the war itself. At some point, when I was older, I said, what was it like to come home? And there was this very long pause, and he said, it was indescribable. You know, and it's funny, because all of a sudden, all these words kind of came to a halt. It seemed like he really had to kind of grope for answers. And again, there was no easy answer to that, I don't think. Right, should I continue, or do you have some more things to say? Because you've had a rest here.
All right. You see, when you talk about coming home, my situation might have been just a little bit different than many, because when I came back from overseas, most of them came back and got discharged. We were here for 30 days, or it was actually 33-day furlough, and then we were to report to Fort Leonard Wood to get shipped to the Pacific for the invasion of Japan. On my next, I think 2 days to go on my second furlough, they dropped the second atomic bomb And Japan immediately sued for peace. So I knew I was not going to the Pacific, because those days they had the point system to get you discharged. And I had more than enough points to get discharged if the war was over. So I went back and I was discharged and came home. We see, my father's first word, "Don't you think it's time to go to work now?" We'll stop and think about it. I'd been on 30-some days furlough and so forth. So the situation is not the same for all. I don't want you to get the idea that I'm not critical of the situation. I understand it. You see, in modern wars, they have tours, so you do get to come home occasionally. But in World War II, if you were in a fighting unit, when you went over, you were going to either come back in a bag, or you were going to come back seriously wounded, lost an arm or a leg or something, so they couldn't fix you up and put you back in. Or you were there till the end of the war. Where now they have tours of duty. Now the Air Force, Air was a little different. It was part of the Army, but they flew so many missions they got to leave to come home. But the fighting man didn't get that, so your situation was a little different. And also a lot of them, you have to remember that the percentage that actually faced, there were 16,200,000 served. Most generals state that in the actual rifle companies, there was less than 10%. That's the guys that facing the German head-on or Japa head-on. Generally, the highest estimates, there's somewhere around tops at 20% saw action. So it's a little different. How when you came home, your memory was different. And some that served in the States, and all were needed. I don't want you to ever get the idea. I never looked. I don't care what branch of service you're in or what your job was. You were all needed, because we couldn't have got over to Europe without people taking us there. We wouldn't have eaten if somebody hadn't done it or got us. You have to have everything. But theirs was just a little bit different, because they did get leaves if you're in the state. You got to come home occasionally, where we'd gone, well, I was just close to 30 months without coming home. So it's a little different. Your attitude's a little different, and especially when you've seen a lot of the worst of mankind. I go to the VA for my medical. And a couple, 3 years ago, Dr. Friedman says, "You need something to help you sleep." No, I'm all right. Well, he says, "I look at your record. You must have, well, maybe once or twice a year I have a night that was kind of rough, primarily because of the concentration camps. No one can ever imagine what they are. The two we were, one of them was men and one was children, or women and children. When we got there was 361 in a mass grave, and another 150 waiting to be put in a grave. And the sights and the sounds and the smells and the stacks of clothing and children, or shoes, and a lot of them are children's. You can't visualize such a thing. You can't imagine a human being wanting to treat another one like that, regardless of what they did. And they weren't all Jewish. There was Greek, there was Germans, there was Russians, a lot of Jewish, naturally. Another company in our regiment, we were told not to give them anything to eat, because the medics had to do that, because some of them, there weren't much left. So they told us that, well, they're begging you for something, and sometimes you gave them something you shouldn't have, maybe you killed them. Another company in our regiment, I didn't realize at the time, smuggled a little 8-year-old boy out of there and made a little uniform like we had for him. We got the area secured, and we were going to go to the States. And they smuggled him on the ship, and I didn't know that. We got on the boat in Le Havre. They smuggled him on the boat. And we got on the boat, of course, taking him up. The sailors didn't care who else was on the boat, not their business. We get to Boston, and word spread around the boat, "Don't get off, don't get off." What the hell's going on? Well, then they told us they'd smuggled this boy on, and immigration wasn't going to let him off the ship. So we said we weren't going to get off. Well, they wanted us to get off, to get us home, get our leave started, because they need us to go to Europe or Japan. Well, they finally agreed, and I still have the newspaper clipping. I read it up in the class to the kids, where it was smart. This little boy was 8 years old, and he had killed a German officer who abused him. And there was so little of him left, they could smuggle him in a duffel bag. Well, they got him aboard, and I understand, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, he came through here one time, and I missed it. He was still in the United States, and of course, he'd grown up here then. But you see, when you see things like that, your attitude is a little different. So I don't want you to get the idea it's all bad. I come home from service, and obviously with a little nudging from my parents, and justifiably so, I went to work. I'm the luckiest person that walks. I started out driving a truck, and then I didn't want to be gone. I went to work on the docks in North Tonawanda, New York, loading trucks for Associated Transport, at the time the largest carrier in the country. And a short time later, they asked me to go in the office, and I went. And from that little meager beginning with no college, went back to college at the age of 85, graduated at 88 over at Lakeland. I became president and CEO of a very large one. In fact, I served on a couple of boards. So I was the luckiest guy in the world. And they said my strength was I was demanding, but I was a very fair boss and realized that you couldn't do it all yourself. Well, if there's one thing you learn, if you come back, if you're in an infantry outfit and you come back, you don't come back because of yourself, you come back because of others. If you survive, it's because a lot of others didn't survive. Here I'm in a division that suffered over 100% casualties. And then the frontline company, that's at a division. Out of the division of 30,000 men, a lot of them are rear echelon. I have a book home, a guy I served with, a lieutenant, he was an officer. He and I were very dear friends until he died here a few years ago. He wrote several books. He was telling one of the books there that from July till, I think it was November, Company E, a company of 190 men went through 650 men, which is not uncommon. The frontline companies to run 300-400% casualties, but the division winds up at 100%. So you learn that you can survive. You survive because of others, and you have to be a team. And it taught me so much that when I was working, that you can't do it all yourself, and you have to trust other people. And it helped me out, and it helped my career, so there's no question I probably wouldn't have made it without it. So I don't look at it as all bad. I had a lot of good things happen to me. Got to see a lot of the world, brewed my interest, so now I've been back to about 35 countries. So it did me some good there, and had a wonderful family. So I don't want you to get the idea I think it was all bad. A lot of it was good. I just try to throw out some of the things that happened. By the way, anybody got a question on anything I've said? Yes, sir.
A little comment on the way businesses treated the veterans when they came back, which is normally very, very well. For example, Chrysler was known to especially employ combat pilots. They looked for these people and they brought them into their company. Others, automotive suppliers, I work for Chrysler, that's how I happen to know that. Clevite, TRW, they welcomed regardless of public opinion, good or bad, the companies in large welcomed the veterans. I think that's a positive thing for sure.
Well, I think they've done that right along. I hear people complain about the VA. I think the VA does a very good job. I think part of the problem the VA has had is there got to be a political football, and a lot of people who shouldn't have been treated by the VA were. So they couldn't handle those that should have been handled. I've run into cases. I'm a service officer and a chaplain. I'm also a hospital chairman because I spend a lot of time for hospice as well as for veterans. Sometimes a guy will complain and say, wait a minute, if I was in the VA, I probably would have rejected what you were asking for. There's a percentage of them, like in all walks of life. I don't care if it's a policeman or a teacher or a guy who works in a plant or a president of a company even. There's always a few that want to abuse the system. There's some of those, I had people that I've talked to they didn't even serve 6 months, and I guess they figured they're supposed to get free lifetime medical care. Well, that's not what the VA was designed for. So I find that most of the time things were handled pretty good. As far as coming back and getting a job, I found you could get an appointment fairly easy. But now you had to want to work too. I mean, they want you to do something for it. You can't just walk in and say, well, I'm a veteran, I expect a job. I mean, it doesn't work that way. Although there are a percentage of them that believe that. But I find that, because veterans are no different than every other walk of life. We have a percentage of them that are, pardon my expression, but they're a real pain in the ass, if you want to be honest about it. And I hate to say that because I'm a big supporter of veterans. I'm a big supporter of the young people. I think the young people are great, but there are a percentage of them that can be a little bit of a problem. But that can be same with old people. Let's be honest about it. But in general, I think the veterans have been treated very good. Now, there's here and there one slips through well, that happens in all walks of life too. But, yes, sir. Yes.
Did the men get their jobs back when they came back, or did?
Well, in some cases, the jobs wasn't there no more.
No, I understand.
And that you can't correct that, or the companies had gone out of business or something. Or you got to remember, the automotive companies didn't make a car from 1942 to 1946. So a lot of jobs that were there in 41 were different. What was out here in Cleveland, I guess the IX was a tank plant. If you had a job there, when you got drafted, there wasn't any job there to come back to. We weren't making tanks no more. So it's easy to, I think too often, I try to be positive because I think there's too often we try to find a negative. We should look for the good things in life. And there's so many good things in life. You had your hand up there, young lady. Yes, ma'am.
As a war baby, I would like to say to you, if you love your freedom, thank a vet, and I thank you. I'd like to know how many war babies are here. If they would be willing to raise their hand.
What era would that be?
1943.
Oh, well, I mean, I was alive in 43.
But to have been born during World War II.
Just before 39.
No, I was.
Okay.
No, I think in general, people are good to veterans. But here and there, most of the time when I sell poppies I've been doing that for years to raise money for disabled veterans for Memorial Day weekend. And a couple of years ago, I was selling poppies out in front of this place. A guy walked up and saw my hat and said something about, he was mad at the VA in Painesville. I said, well, I always got good service, so I don't know what you're talking about. They won't give me a hearing aid. He's talking a lot lower than I am, and I could hear him and he could hear me. He was only in the service 7 or 8 months when he got discharged. He said, well, I was out on the firing range and it bothers my hearing. I'm thinking to myself, if I was the VA, I'd have probably told you to get the hell out of here. No, seriously, I mean, it'd be easy to sit there and sympathize with him. I said to him, I'm sorry, sir, but I'm not the guy to talk to about this because I don't think you're entitled to it. Then he wouldn't buy a poppy. You don't buy a poppy, I understand that. Well, no, but seriously, to me, real courage is not being in battle. Real courage is having the strength to stand up for your convictions. And I believe he was wrong. And I told him so. I find this happens a lot. I'm a service officer, so they ran a big seminar down in Delaware, Ohio here 2-3 years ago. Well, I've been a service officer for the Legion and the VFW both for many years, but I said, maybe I'll go down to it. Lasted from 9 in the morning till 4 o'clock. So I get down there and we had a packed house. So from 9 o'clock until about 10:30, all I heard about was how all these complaints. So the guy who was leading the seminar said, I think we ought to take a coffee break now. So I stuck my hand up in the air. And he said, sir, did you want, yes? I said, before we take a break, I'm kind of confused. I guess maybe I'm in the wrong place. I've had such good luck with the VA, helping people, and they treat me so well. And all I've heard here this morning is the VA must be the worst organization in the world. And I don't understand that. Either I'm doing something wrong or there's something wrong someplace. And then a couple other guys jumped up and said, I agree with that man. I agree with him. So they took a break, and these two men and a lady walk up to me and they said, thank you. I said, thank me for what? We're from the VA. I didn't know the VA was there. I said, well, you do a good job. After the coffee break, it was amazing how many good comments people had about the VA. But I guess when one bad guy said it was bad, somebody else had to jump on the bandwagon instead of having the courage to say, no, you're wrong, sir. I never forget, I had the privilege one time of hearing Martin Luther King give a speech. I didn't always agree with him, but he said, you know, I understand those that are against us. What bothers me is all the good people who sit silently by and say nothing. I thought it was one of the greatest comments I ever heard a man make. But he was right. So many oftentimes the good people refuse to stand up to be counted. And I see so many good ones out there. Whether it's older people or young people. You know, last year at the Veterans Day at the high school, they had me speak at the Veterans Day services. And I said, when I'm through, I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. One was I read a letter that I had written from a foxhole on Christmas Eve, 1944. I said, and then in conclusion, I'd like to leave you with a thought. When you go into battle, you don't care if all those around you, what political party they belong to, what church they go to, what nationality they are. You're just awful glad there are Americans with you. I said, I think it'd do all of you good to remember that. I had so many kids come up to me afterwards, gave me a hug and thanked me. It was amazing. But you don't. When you go into battle, you were in service. Did you really care what the guy was? I didn't care if it was a Democrat, Republican, or Protestant. It made no difference to me. Huh? But seriously, all we wanted was a friend. Really, and I think so often huh?
You depended on them.
You're dependent on them because they're going to help you get back. So you really didn't care, and shouldn't we think that way as Americans, really? I don't know, I guess I'm nuts. But anyway, any other questions out there? Anybody about anything? I don't know, I'll answer anything.
Did you grow up in North Tonawanda?
No, I lived in Tonawanda for about 11, I got transferred there. I lived there for 11 years.
Okay.
North Tonawanda was where the office was, on the little islands where the trucking company's office was. Yeah, well, you from there?
My first husband was. His parents taught in the school system there.
Oh, my late wife lived in Tonawanda, grew up there. Then she came to our hometown and taught school. She was a high school teacher in those days. We were married over 61 years. And she died soon be 9 years ago, and I married this very attractive chick sitting back there from Lithuania. She was also a teacher. I mean, she was taught biology and geology in Lithuania for 34 years. She's a little bit younger than me. Elvira, is that right? She's helped me get over my shyness. No, but serious, I get preached and I go, shut up. I shut up. I just think we should look more for the good in people than all the bad. I don't know. We always seem to find a way to find something wrong with them, and I can't do that. I never have. I have a large family. I have 4 children, 7 grandchildren, soon to have 7 great-grandchildren. They're all doing good. If they didn't, I would look in the mirror. Can't blame the kids, blame me. I must have not done a very good job. I mean, if they're good, I guess I'll take a little credit. If they did bad, I got to take the real line.
What was the biggest change you found when you came back? What was the biggest change in either society or industry or anything? What was the biggest change you saw from when you left and when you came back?
After the war? During the war, you mean?
No, after the war, when you came home.
Oh, after we came home. Well, I think for one thing, the greatest thing that our country could ever done, not because it was the GI Bill of Rights allowed a group of men to go to college that never would have gone otherwise. during the Depression, we might have had 1 or 2 person in my class that went to college. They came back from the service, they could go to college. We educated a group who became leaders because of it. I think the education part of the GI Bill did more for our country's growth than any single thing. Of course, after that, the younger group took it over and did it. But at that point, it was not unusual for people in the late 30s and early 40s to quit school at 16, go to work. I mean, the percentage of graduation was a lot lower than it is today. And here they come back from the service, some of them had to get a GED or whatever it was to finish up their high school, and then they went on to college. A lot of them became doctors, leaders. The GI Bill of Rights did so much for our country, and for the people too, I mean, obviously, but did a lot for our country. For a country that was switching from, in the 30s, we were still a lot of agricultural. Today is nothing in agriculture. It'll grow a lot, but it's all with machines. I mean, in those days it was all handwork. No, that's a big change. I thought the GI Bill of Rights did so much for people. I'd like to find a way to do more of it. Education's our future. Today, without education, you haven't got a chance.
Yep. No, for sure.
Anything else out there? Don't be afraid. I don't care. Ask me anything. Yes, sir.
Well, it is interesting to think about the transfer from an agricultural society to a manufacturing society, because that was forced really by the war. They had to build the tanks.
That's right.
Aircraft.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, it could have stopped there, and we would have been okay, possibly, because, I mean, right now we don't want to be shipping manufacturing elsewhere out of this country, but the computer business kind of replaced some of the manufacturing, but not all, because...
Yeah, we're in the technology age today, so... No.
At the time, by the way, you know, a college education was not necessarily required for a lot of jobs as it is now. And I had an uncle who had stopped his education at a high school diploma, and he was a board of directors of three companies. So things are different then.
Well, college is not for everybody. There's no question about it. We have to have tradesmen. We need plumbers, we need carpenters, we need electricians, we need policemen, we need a lot of things. But the percentage of unskilled jobs has disappeared dramatically. I mean, today, even to work on an automobile, when I was a kid, I'd take a car apart, nothing to it, open the hood, there's nothing to it. Today, they're all computers. You better know what you're doing. And you open the hood, you look at it and say, what's this? Seriously, the thing has changed so dramatically in our system. So without education today, you don't have a chance. That's why I encourage young people. But there's a need for tradesmen too. Some people just aren't cut off for college. I understand, not a criticism.
I think today an undergraduate degree equals a high school graduation when we were coming out of the intelligence bins.
Well, I thank all of you coming and listening to me. I get rambling along. I didn't mean to do that. I'm honored to have someone I work with at hospice here this evening. Susan Peters has been in hospice a long time, and I'm with hospice a long time. Hospice is kind of a favorite of mine. I've been with them a long time in different capacities. I'm not a paid one, I'm a volunteer. But they have, they have, huh?
We're blessed to have you.
Yeah, it's a wonderful organization, and you do so much for people. And I try to encourage young people to find some little thing to do to help others. I don't care what it is, or whether it's cutting the grass to some old lady next door or something, but we should all offer to help somebody else a little bit someplace. There's a satisfaction that you can't believe. I'm at a nursing home just about every day of the week someplace, or at a private home sitting with them because the husband's got dementia and you can't leave him alone while she goes shopping. It seems when you have a busy day, you sleep so much better that night, I guess, because sometimes you have to help feed them, help dress them, whatever you have to do, you do. And there's a satisfaction to it that's hard to beat. People help me, so I guess I should help back.